Check, 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 check. There we go. That's good. That's up. That's good to go. All right, how's everybody doing? Good. Everybody got their notebooks ready? Put that over here. Put this there. Good. And everybody can hear me on the live stream. Just give me a thumbs up over there. Let me know that that is working. Great. Okay, we're going to talk about some other modifiers first, and then move on to some actual information about the materials. But let's, we talked about some of our core modifiers. We need to round that out here. And in most all of these instances, these are things that exist both as modifiers and as tools. And so with that in mind, you got to remember that this is going to be adjustable. You'll hear me use the word often procedural when we're using modifiers, and so this can be a very flexible way to work. And then when we work with tools, this is the destructive version, meaning that it makes permanent changes to the geo. The screen's not on in here. It was going out, so we're good. Come on, TV. There we go. Modifiers, procedural. You can adjust them throughout the process. And tools are destructive in that they make permanent changes to the geometry or the topology. The word destructive makes it sound like, why would I ever want to use tools? Why not just use modifiers all the time? Because of the sort of negative connotation that the word destructive has. I'm telling you this word because it's the vocabulary that's used when people are discussing these kind of things. It's that this is the destructive way to do the kind of work, and that you're permanently changing the bits, the storage of the whole thing. But maybe a better term that I use often here is direct drive. This is the advantage that using tools offers, is that you just sort of directly manipulate the thing. I use the tool to shave off this part or round this edge, and I'm done. That's it, right? There's no existing modifier that I need to keep track of the settings for. There's no interplay between this modifier and another modifier, all those kind of things. And so this somewhat analogous to sort of real sculpting, right? You chip a piece of rock off the big piece of rock and that's it. You can't put it back, right? Here, we can always put it back, right? Even with the destructive tools, you can always Control Z your way back to some previous state. And if you're using all the proper saving and autosave like we've talked about, you can always just go back to some previous autosave and try again, right? So it's not destructive in the same way that, you know, chipping off a piece of marble is destructive, but similar work mindset. Here, right, because this is procedural and adjustable, this means that we can, you know, it's much more flexible way to work, but it adds a not insignificant amount of complexity to everything. And so, especially here at the beginning, this may be a deal breaker in that when we use one or two modifiers, that's fine, but you can end up with many, many modifiers and not really understanding the way that they're working together, or understand that the stack of the modifiers ends up being important. And so the flexibility of the procedural work comes at a cost, and the cost is not to the computer, it's to your mind, right? Are you able to properly and accurately represent what's happening here? Because the modifier, the flexibility, the way you implement flexibility is through abstraction. No longer are you the one with the chisel hitting the rock. You're writing, you know, essentially writing the code that controls the computer hand that controls 100 computer arms that are chipping off pieces of the rock, right? And so obviously there's a huge scaling advantage there in that this allows for work at a scale that is not possible for one person and a chisel, right? A person controlling 100 chisel computer arms is ostensibly more powerful than one person with a chisel, given the same amount of time. But sometimes there's just too much complexity for the project. I just need to round out this ball. I just need to make this edge curved, right? And then using the tool would be the more direct drive way to do it. Okay, so with that in mind, let's look at a couple things. First of all, I sort of set up a new default here. You too can have a new default. And so up here under File, Defaults, Save Startup File. And so here, I'm going to go ahead and say that. And so now when I Control N and make a new general, there we go. I get this as my starting point. And so all of the settings that I've checked over and over again here now are there ready to go. And there's, you know, the table is set for some kind of work there. This is the lowest level of this, right? Like the idea that, okay, well, I have these things I check all the time. In the computer, if you find yourself repeating an action, like, okay, well, this will be quote unquote a lot of work in the computer where like I'm going to need to like click this dialog box 20 times to make this happen. That's a sign that perhaps you're not using the computer correctly, or like that's what the computer should be able to do, is iterate on things quickly. And so here, the idea that we can sort of save this preset and save us a lot of setup clicking, and then eventually you could have multiple presets, right? You could have one for modeling, one for whatever, you know, different sort of starting points from which to jump off on there. Good. Okay, so we've got this here. Let's look at the bevel modifier and then go from there. That'll be the first one we look at in our list. Here we go. Bevel, which is going to round an edge. It also sort of spreads points, but most of the time here and today we're just going to focus on the edge part of it. So this is something to keep in mind. Yeah, we'll work on the edge part. Rounding edge. Why is having rounded edge important? This is one of the lowest hanging bars to clear in terms of making things look more realistic. This is the word people will use online. However, a lot of computer graphics tutorials and Blender media in general assumes that what you want is hyper-realism, that your artistic aim is to reproduce the way the real world looks in Blender, which is an inappropriate assumption. You can make all sorts of different, it's just a tool. You could make abstract art or impressionist art or whatever it is that you want to make. But the better term here is, I think, convincing, in that we don't need to be aimed directly at hyper-realism all the time. In fact, there's absolutely no mandate for that here. And so with that in mind, this is one of the things that having the rounded edges helps make things look more convincing, because they just, that'll allow them to interact with the light in a more convincing way. Why is this the case? It's because the default edge, right, where we have two edges meet each other at a perpendicular angle here, this is going to be too perfect. You'll hear me talk about this over and over and over and over again throughout the semester. This is part of doing computer graphics work, is that the computer, the strength of the computer is that it's iterative. You can do a thing, a process, hundreds, thousands, millions of times and scale it, but it does it deterministically, perfectly. If you tell it to do it the same every time, it does it the same every time. And this often produces artistically undesirable results, right? It's a kind of working at scale which humans are, incapable of, creating atom by atom perfect replicas of some sort of original, right? You could be close, but not exactly the same. By default, the computer does it exactly the same every time. And then in this instance, this edge right here, you can think of this edge just at the edge of the default cube. This is sort of so perfectly sharp that there's actually, as far as the computer rendering is concerned, there's no stuff, there's no substance, there's no surface on the edge where these two meet. They meet at this mathematically perfect edge. It's the same way you need to think about the points in the computer. You can think about the point as the speck, but that is incorrect. It's actually this mathematically infinitely small point in space that has no substance. If you have one edge, if you just have edges and points in Blender, they won't render as anything. There's nothing there for the light to hit. And so here, this is too perfect. And so the light will not bounce off of the edge in a way that looks convincing. Not necessarily realistic, just convincing, dynamic. Even if we're not making realistic art, often we want the image to interact with light in a way that we are familiar with and in a way that is more nuanced. So we need to bevel the edge in order to have some kind of surface that the light can bounce off of, right? So now there's an extra face there at an angle that's in between this and this. And so when light hits it, it'll bounce off. And this will appear like a specular highlight. And a specular highlight, the way I'm using that most of the time, it's going to be a reflection of a light source. So in EV in particular, the reflection of light sources and the reflection of other things are separated. In the real world, that's not the case. Photons are photons, whether they're coming out of a light bulb or bouncing off of a wall. It's all the same photon physics system. Here, in order to render things in some sort of reasonable amount of time, these two systems are separated. So specular highlight refers just to light sources. Okay, so that's the explanation. Let me show you. Okay, so here's regular cube. I'm going to Shift D this cube, X, move it over, and then apply the bevel deformer to the second cube. Turn off the sunlight for a moment so I can have a point light, which is right here. There we go. And this needs to be a little bit brighter. And then the material that's on this will make this shinier by turning the roughness down. Perhaps turn the metallic up a little bit. So here we can see the difference. The cube on screen right has a very small but beveled edge, whereas the cube, closer, downstage, screen left, has no bevel. And so if you look at the edge here, there is no specular highlight, right? Where the light would be reflected on that edge. And in real life, even if you made a very precise, sharp sphere, there would still be substance. There would still be a surface, even at the very sharp edge. And so here, let's crank up the light to make it even more obvious. There we go. So now I'm getting a stronger specular highlight there. Over here, I am not. And so this is a big deal. This precipitates a lot of your decision making in terms of 3D modeling. Because in order to make this happen, you usually need to make a cascading series of decisions about how you're going to model. And so this, a lot of students quickly identify as sort of like a retro, sort of old-fashioned style. And yeah, that's correct. Previously, like I've discussed before, what's usually referred to as retro in computer graphics is just simply as good as they could make it look. At the time, the computers weren't capable of having beveled edges on every surface, on every object, on every shape that was in the machine. And so we had these unbeveled edges that look like this. So there may be an instance in which you want to engage with that retro look or make things that are of that retro style. And in that case, you wouldn't be beveling or rounding the edges. And so that would, in a lot of instances, simplify the modeling workflow. But even for things that aren't realistic, just for things that are more convincing, having the rounded edge really helps define the shapes. If I were to look at this one, so here I'm going to change this to cube beveled, and
Where did you add the bevel?
in the modifier, I'll do that in a second. Yeah. It's just the demo right now, not the walkthrough. There we go. let's try, I'm going to make a area light. There we go. So the area light is like it's coming out of a box. So here we can really see more of this effect again in terms of the specular highlight here, the reflection of. Changing this to local makes it a little bit easier to manipulate this light. Scale it up. Turn it up. Right? And so here, all of this along the edge here, that I'm going to grab this and shade smooth it. Shade smoothing over here would just kind of obliterate the shading. It's obviously not what we want. And so see how there is no specular highlight on the edge here. So this is what's this decision here, this artistically driven decision, where it's like we want our objects to have specular highlights. This is going to change a lot of our modeling decisions. Doing this kind of work in the computer, just like anything else really, the image that you want to achieve at the end determines your workflow. That's not, now the artistic process is not always that neat, right? Whereas like, oh, I want to make this, therefore I will follow this workflow and achieve that end, right? Things are never usually that clean, in that you start going in one direction, realize that that's not going to work, have to go back and do a different direction. But there we go. All right, so now the bevel modifier. What did I do here? On this one, I'll go ahead and get rid of it. And so here on the beveled cube, I'll go ahead and go to the modifiers tab and add the bevel. And we can see what this is doing. I'll go into wireframe so we can see this, and I'll switch the wireframe to random. That makes it easier to see things. And so this, you can see, is doing exactly what I drew in that diagram, that we have a face that is now along the edge, where the edge was. So the important things the most important parameters here are the amount. How big is this face that we're inserting along the edge? And so if I dial this up, you can see we can bevel this extremely, like to massively change the topology of the object, right? If you're using this in this way, usually you're applying it to make some other shape that you would, like obviously like gem-like things you could do like this. But a lot of times you're just taking the existing edges and just making them more convincing. And then the subdivisions in that face that we've put there. And so if I turn this up, watch what happens to the edges here. There. Now we have two subdivisions over here. And if I go back to the view here, if I look at this, yeah. Once you start using the bevel modifier, you're almost certainly not, you're going, yeah, almost, this would be a good rule of thumb. Bevel mod requires shade smooth. You're not really using shade flat in that instance, right? Because then we get this obvious faceting of these smoother rounded corners that we've got here. And so if I shade smooth, there we go. That looks better. Some other things to keep in mind here. Other rules for the bevel. 1 is fine. And then beyond that, if you're going to subdivide the bevel, using even numbers is preferable. This makes it easier to divide in half. So this is a general principle that if you're not, anytime you're subdividing things, ending up with an even number so you can take whatever you subdivided and easily slice it in half is usually the better way to go, unless you know you're aiming at some very specific type of topology, right? The 5-armed starfish is the one I always throw out there, where they're, subdividing radially by 5 is necessary in order to achieve that topology. But here, having subdivisions of 2, this is for the bevel subdivision. And so here, if we look at it in wireframe mode, right, if I go to 3, right, and then I have to cut off this front face for some reason, now I'm stuck in a situation where if I cut it here, then I have 2 on this side and 1 on that side because of the nature of the number 3. Whereas if I went to 4, there we go. Now I can easily divide this and this. This becomes important when we UV unwrap stuff. And so there's that. And so this is the piece of the puzzle here, which would help improve a lot of those tools that we talked about on last week, the extrude and the inner extrude, in terms of taking the buildings and having your buildings actually interact with the edge of the light. So this one is just simply how far we're rounding there, right? And so you can see if I have more subdivisions in the bevel, and I start to bevel a whole lot, I can get to something that looks, I can do that cube to sphere. All I'm doing is dialing up the amount here, right? But if I have less subdivisions, it certainly won't look like that. If I go back down to 1, that's when I was getting that gem-like looking, right? Because a single face will not be bent, right? In order to create curvature, we need to subdivide the faces. Recursive edge splitting. So as we continually split the edge and round the results, we get this rounding, like so. And just like we discussed before, essentially the larger the bevel in space, the more subdivisions it takes to sort of make it look smooth. Unless you're going for, that gem shaved off sharp corner, you need more subdivisions. And so, for instance, if we were to duplicate this one, right, if I were beveling this much over here, this might necessitate 6. Where over here, if I'm beveling this much, this is really a 2 over here, right? Because just the same rule applies. How much topology do we want? Mark. Just enough. And so having, what you don't want to see is this, okay? Watch the edge of the sharp sphere, things like this, right? If you go into wireframe mode and you see chunks of edges that look solid because they're so close together, this is almost certainly not what you want. Yeah, Kevin chimed in with just enough as well. And so there we go. So more subdivisions over here to make that look smoother, less subdivisions over here to represent the edge. Now, the next parameter over here, by default, how does it know what to bevel? It's going to bevel things that are greater in angle than this threshold. Okay, so there's a lot of things, especially when we're talking about angles, a lot of parameters in Blender that the angle threshold, this is going to be greater than that. So for instance, here's another advantage of using the modifier. I can tab into edit mode and model, and I can see the results while I'm modeling, right? So if I inset this and then extrude it like so. There we go. You see that the bevel is happening live on my modeling right there, right? And so now I'm going to grab this edge just to demonstrate this and go back to here and maybe turn this one off for a second. And notice how I cannot select. I can select here. I can't select here. Why not? I can select this one, not that one. Sean. It's the only line that's actually there. Yes, the original line. It's the original edge, right? These edges are being generated by the modifier, right? And so, generative, procedurally created by the modifier. If I right-click and say Convert to Mesh, then I could get access to those edges. But I don't want to do that right now so that it continues to just automatically bevel whatever I would make. But here, if we were to look at this, I'm going to move this edge. And so as I move it, there we go. And so right there, the angle between here and here drops below 30 degrees. And you see the bevel goes away on that edge. That's how this functions. Right? Because we don't want to, ideally, you don't want to be adding, there's no need to round here because this is a fairly flat surface as it is. Okay, so this, you can adjust this, right? And depending on what you would need, you could do that there. But, yeah. And if I were to turn this down, there we go. Now it comes back because I've dropped it below 21.7. which is where this is. So now it stays beveled until I get it almost straight. And so you can see the procedural geometry, created, not created, created, not created, based on this limit method angle. Here, let's say we wanted different bevels, right? I want this sharp-ish bevel on all of my edges, but then here, I want to change the overall shape. I want to turn this into something more like that, like a rounded, a rounding that is much larger than the rounding that's happening here. Now, knowing what you know, you can properly identify that as a bevel, but we have essentially, well, I have the bevel modifier. How would I do this other bevel? Do I stack multiple bevel modifiers? That's not what I would recommend right now. What I would recommend is that we use the bevel tool to make this big round bevel, and then let the bevel modifier do all of the procedural bevels around the shape. And so I've got this edge here, and the bevel tool is over here. And so if you click on the tool, and then anytime you get this yellow handle, this is the handle for using the tool in Blender. And so you click on the handle and drag, and you can see it beveling only that edge, because that's the edge that I had selected. So again, select an edge or multiple edges, whatever, and click and drag. And yeah, I'm not changing, all I'm changing is that one edge right there. But it's flat. I want it to be a big round thing. And so remember, down here, you want this open pretty much all the time so that you can see these are the parameters for the tool you're using. And so you can click and drag and let go. And then before you click anywhere else, because if you click anywhere else, boom, now you've sort of committed to that tool usage. You have to Control Z and go back. Right? So now I do this. There we go. Now I can, the tool is quote unquote still live, and I can make these adjustments. For instance, the major adjustment here would be to round this out like so. Right? And so now I can get this change in the shape of the feature by beveling this with the bevel tool, while the bevel modifier rounds those smaller edges. The bevel modifier is still alive. And now that you're using this, another good one to use is holding down Shift while dragging allows you to make much, much finer changes. It changes the number while you're dragging by a much smaller amount. And so if you click on something, you find you have a hard time dialing it in with the mouse, holding down Shift while you're doing that makes that a little bit easier. Okay, questions about what I did there, right? So this change was made using the bevel tool, whereas all the other rounding was done using the bevel modifier. And this is a classic modifier versus tool situation. Using the bevel modifier for the edges like this is really the best practice, because you can see how much extra small geometry it creates. If you have to go back and edit all that small geometry by hand, that ends up being really not great, often very prohibitive. So if we look at it over here, there we go. And so tab out, there we go. And so once I start adding more detail to my surface, if we look at the bevel modifier, I'm going to click the tiny little computer. This essentially toggles the modifier on and off. And so you can, let me turn it back to shade flat. Right, so there it is. See how this looks, for lack of a better word, kind of janky and old style, versus turning this on and going to shade smooth, and boom. Now we have something that looks like a much more convincing surface because it has some surface on the edge. As the light moves around, if I come back and select the light, here it is. So for right now, I would probably leave this angle where you want it to be at 30. And then the other parameter here, Blender does a fairly decent job of making the most important parameters the ones that are immediately viewable. But then there's other sections down here that have more parameters that are things you usually don't need to dive into as often. However, in the bevel modifier under shading, especially when you're making things that like this, where we have flat edges, this looks like a machined or like a machine-made part. The one that usually makes it look a little bit flatter on the flat surfaces is harden normals. And so watch what this does. Right, especially here, sort of a subtle, the shading, this is affecting the shading, right? So it's a much more subtle effect than shade flat versus shade smooth. It's sort of this, you would only use this when you're in shade smooth. It's essentially tightening the smooth shading so that the flat surfaces appear flatter, whereas we get the highlight over there. So most of the time, having this checked is, if you're taking the time to use the bevel modifier for edges like this, is something you're going to want to have that checked. It should really be the default, but it's not. The other ones here for now, I don't think there's anything else we need to worry about there. And so if I tab back in here, you can see again how this might work. I can use some of these tools. I'm going to inset up here, extrude, there we go. Let's inset here and extrude in, there we go. And then all of this, tab out, is, we're getting these nice rounded edges on the inner side, on the outer side, especially for this, the name, when you're looking for this kind of stuff, researching these kind of things, all this sort of extrude, inner extrude, bevel workflow, this falls under the umbrella of hard surface modeling. In general, this is the process for creating mechanistic kind of stuff, robots, machines, things that need to have, things that are not going to usually squash and stretch, right? Mechanistic stuff all falls under this hard surface modeling.
Can you make a preferred, can you make a preset of the modifier so that if you're working on a whole bunch of like beams or girders or something, that they all bevel, like you don't have to keep applying and adjusting?
Yes. It's one of these guys up here. I thought it was in here. There we go. Yeah, there's a bunch of add-ons that do this. Also, the asset browser kind of does this. The default vanilla Blender, so we can look at that stuff later. We're probably not going to do the asset browser this week. But the short answer there is that you would just copy the modifier from the one that you have set to the other one. In Blender, this is all referred to as linking. Okay, so if you want to copy the material from one object to another object, if you want to copy other data, you link them. And so you got to do this kind of, so select, again, remember the order of selection in Blender is critical. And so if you select here, Control L brings up your link menu, and then there's copy modifiers. There we go. And so you select the one you want to copy from second. So click, Control L, copy, and now this one has the same modifier as this one, and it has the same settings as this one. So that's the shortest answer without getting into a bunch of add-on.
You're clicking on the first two modifiers and then Control L to link to the next one?
I'm not clicking on modifiers at all. I'm just clicking on the objects, right? You link the you select which objects, then you Control L, and if you look, there's a whole bunch of stuff you can link here, right? So link materials, all this other stuff, and one of the options in the Control L is copy modifiers, and that's there. But is the link thing part of an add-on? I can't quite remember. I think that's just default. This is where Blender really falls on its face, is not knowing if the thing I'm using is the result of an add-on that's put in or not. Although, I mean, to be fair, other programs don't really do that either. But in Blender, you end up adding so many add-ons that it becomes a bit difficult. I think it's just there, right? I mean, if you select two things and press Control L, do you get that menu?
Yeah.
Okay, all right, yeah, so it's just part of the default.
It's not going on.
Yeah, the order. So here, then here, Control L, copy modifiers. If you get it the order wrong, it'll just delete the bevel modifier on the other one because the other one doesn't have a modifier, right? So if I go here to here and Control L and copy modifiers there, it just deleted because there's no modifier on this one, and it was over here. And so yeah, the order, right? This is why Blender gives you that different color orange, right? For those of you who haven't made a mental note to pay attention to this, the dark orange are the first set of things you clicked on. The bright orange is the last thing you clicked on, and this becomes functionally super important when you're using the program. It'd be great to have something we could just sort of drag the modifier onto something else, but it doesn't happen. Okay, and then someone asked about the bevel tool on the live stream. There we go. Okay, and so here if we tab in, select the bevel tool and select an edge. So you're going for right now, you're going to want to be in edge mode, in edit mode, right? So you can only, the tools, I said this last time, but just to make sure you have it in your notes, the tools are used in edit mode because you're changing the geometry. The edit mode is where you go into to access the raw geometry. The modifiers happen and are adjusted in object mode because they're applied to the entire object. So the tools here, bevel, click and drag the handle, and then we get the menu over here to adjust. What drives people crazy here at the beginning is they do this, then they either don't get what they want, and they don't know that this menu over here is there, and then they click off of it, and now I've lost my opportunity to adjust that bevel. And so you want to have this lower left-hand contextual menu open. So now I do it again, boom, then it happens, and now I can adjust this to make it as smooth as I would want. Adjust the width even more. Those are the main things for right now. Make sure it's in edge mode. Okay, we're not worrying about beveling vertices right now. We'll address that eventually, but not today. And so this is right now I would tell you to use the tool when I need to make a major change to the shape, right? Those sharp, slightly rounding the sharp edges is not a massive change to the shape, right? It's more of a change that we're doing in order to make the rendering work. You would use the bevel tool if you need to go in and massively change what it is that you're doing, right? So now if I grab this one and round over here and then change a little bit over here, there we go. Okay, now the danger with the bevel. So watch what happens here. I grabbed not just one of the edges, but sort of like this whole side over here. So watch what happens. If I start beveling here, like so, that's fine until I get into this situation. So over here. This is no good, right? Where we've beveled so far but that now things are running over each other. You can see how this has turned things inside out here. This is unequivocally bad and going to create nothing but problems later on. In the tool, does it have the limit on the tool? Seams, hard norms, minor, inner. No, it doesn't. So when you're using the tool, being aware of this, right? Especially once you start using it on denser geometry. If I just do it that far and then turn this up, this is fine. But if I drag it further, you can see how this would be a huge problem at that point, right? That's not how we would create that shape. When you're using the modifier, it has a governor on it, a limiter to prevent you from doing this, right? So if I take this one here, remember this doesn't have a bevel modifier on it. This change and this change I made using the bevel tool. And so if I come in here and put the modifier on it, there we go. I get that on the edges, and then I can maybe round it a little bit, and then watch what happens here. So I should be able to dial this up, and then there we go. Here we go. I'm dialing the size of the bevel, and I'm moving, and you see that once I hit this limit here where things are going to cross over each other, it will go no further. And so the modifier has this governor on it to save you from yourself. You can turn this off. I'm going to regret even showing you this. Under this is clamp overlap. And so it clamps it. It doesn't let you go beyond that. If I turn this off and then dial this up, it lets me just destroy the shape, which we pretty much don't want to do. So don't click that. But the tool does not have that built in. So just to see an applied instance of this, if I come back here and do something along the lines of what we were talking about with our buildings, our very simple buildings, if we took this and extruded this up a bunch, and then I Control R to do some loop cutting, perhaps right here, like so, and Control R here, maybe do some loop cuts that way. There we go. And Control R over here, and do some loop cuts that way. Okay, good. Now, I should have made one more cut. Anyway, we'll just make some extrusions here. So now I'm just going to select some areas for the windows like we talked about. And now I have things selected on multiple sides. And so under the extrude, I need to make sure I use extrude along normals, right? So that they go out or in. If I just were to press E, it makes them all go out in one direction or in one direction. Anytime you're selecting multiple faces along some sort of changing angle, you need the extrude along normals, which makes sense now because we all know what the normal angle is, right? It's doing it to 90 degrees to the surface of the respective face. And so there we go. And now that was all tool usage. I'll use the bevel modifier here to now take our building to the next level in terms of make this a little bit, again, I'm holding down Shift. I'll use 2, and then it's a building, so I want it to look, the flat sides to look flat, so I'll use the hardened normals. And there we go. And so now if I were to, let's turn this one off and turn the sunlight back on. There we go. Now, if I tab out, you see that the edges of our building look far more convincing, right? They interact with the light in some sort of, in a way that real world objects would look, even if they had sharp-ish edges, right? Just even that gives us this extra definition along the actual surface, right? That's why I'm saying I'm avoiding using the term looks more realistic. It just looks more, this is more artistically desirable in in a greater amount of stylistic decisions, right? Why is that? Because these specular highlights help define the shape of the object. And that's usually artistically desirable in, even if you're not making something that's quote unquote hyper realistic, right? We want to be able to have clearly defined contours and shapes usually in a lot of different artistic applications. Okay, questions about that? Everybody feel like they got a good handle on what beveling is? You can do it with the modifier, you can do it with the tool. Okay, and starting the modifier versus tool thing, which one should I use? This is, I would say a higher level skill that you sort of develop as you go along. Remember, at the end of the day, it's just a spreadsheet of points, edges, and faces for the computer. So you could get to all of this geometry using either of them, right? But there's the artistic process part of it, right? Do you want to be able to go back and adjust things? Are you working with a client where you know they're going to change stuff? And so do you want to construct it in a way that you be able to go back and easily adjust it later versus the client wants some sort of arbitrary, terrible change to it, and now you have to go back and rebuild it from scratch versus coming in and making a very quick edit. And so, yeah, working for yourself versus working in a team or working with a client may necessitate different construction workflows.
I have a question. When you apply, so if you're doing like I set up a bunch of New York townhouses, and there's no bevel on it right now. But if I'm adding a bunch of windows, I have a door, and they're all going to be the same. When do I add the modifier? Because the door bevel will be different than the building bevel. So if I just add the modifier to the whole object, it's applying the same bevel size unless I go into the tool and start changing all the windows. Do you understand what I'm asking?
Yeah, so you can have the modifiers constrained. So if we come in here and Shift D to a different subset of edges. So in here, I'm going to change the limit method from angle to vertex group. And so vertex group is going to be a selection. We did this with the materials, right? We're adding materials to a different, vertex group. So here, remember vertex group is going to be over here in our data. And so for instance, I'm going to select these. I'm going to come over here to the this side, okay? And I'm going to say make a new vertex group, and I'm going to call this right side, for lack of a better term, and assign that, okay? And so now I can come back to my bevel modifier, and now that I've gone from, remember the default is angle, to vertex group. Now when you switch it to vertex group, the interface changes and it asks you which group, and you say right. And so now if you dial this up here, you'll see that it is only beveling, right? This side remains unchanged, and so that side is beveled and the other side is not. And so now I could have a second modifier over here, right? And so if I say add another bevel modifier over here, and then on this one we want to constrain it to just this side, so we need to make a vertex group to do that. And so over here, tab into edit mode, alt click over here to grab these, make a new vertex group and call this left, and assign, that's the part I usually miss, and then come back over here, and then make sure that this one is also set to vertex group, and then left. And so now this one is independent from, right? So this one's rounded and subdivided, this one is not, and so we have two different shapes there. It's probably easier to see if we can look at it with the material on, right? And so there's one bevel, there's another bevel. They're both procedural. So as is usual, this is great. This is totally flexible, right? Yes, it is. But it also took the most amount of setup time, right? And also, organization beforehand, right? So the least applicable to the sort of freewheeling direct drive approach. Whereas we could have done this with the tool and just done this one, then done that one, and that would have been it. And we wouldn't have been able to go back and adjust it, but now we can go back and adjust it. There's a limit to this, right? I mean, how many bevel modifiers are you going to wrangle, right? You can fold up the modifiers over here so that the stack, is condensed, and then, unfold them to get all the stuff here. And you can also, once you start doing this at this scale, starting to label all of this stuff, bevel doors, bevel windows, bevel structure, or whatever it is. Then you'll have each of those separately. So you got to come up and set up those vertex groups. There's probably an add-on that lets you select something and then hit a key to make a vertex group for it. I can imagine that's something someone has made. If not, I'll look for it. But I'll have to check. Right, that's the powerful thing. There's so many people using the tool that they're developing all sorts of things for it. But literally, there's so many now that it's tough to find things and determine what works and doesn't. Okay, so good question, right? And that's the answer to most of the modifiers have not all of them, but most of them have a version of that where the power of the modifiers that procedurally applies to the entire object, but sometimes you don't want it to apply to the entire object, and the vertex group is one way to sort of take care of that, where you define, you save a selection of vertices, and then it applies it to just those things. There's other ways to do this. You can sort of weight paint things and stuff like that, but it's similar conceptually to what's happening here.
And that's still in object mode.
Yeah.
Right? Because it's
Well, no, I had to go into edit mode to select the
yeah.
vertices, right? So when I came down here to make these vertex groups, then I switched to edit mode so that I could do that. Why is my thing not staying on over here? I want that screencast keys to stay on. There we go. So what I'm hitting shows up down there. Okay. Okay. So yeah, actually it'd be great if we all, so the screencast keys add-on, that way when you record your video, we could see what keys you're hitting as well. That may be an important clue as we Sherlock Holmes our way through all sorts of 3D modeling problems. So it's clear to everyone why we'd want to go through this trouble, right? It's visually obvious why this is desirable in many, many, many instances, right? And the two different ways we can do that. Okay, so that's good. Okay, let's package this stuff up. And so I'm just going to do that in a collection. There we go. And okay. Okay, the mirror modifier. This one makes things that are symmetrical. And so, actually, we don't want this here. Well, first of all, I made this sphere here, and I apply the mirror modifier, and nothing happens. This is most of the time the initial student response is, I want to make something symmetrical, and I put it on there, and it looks like nothing happened. In fact, something did happen. You sort of doubled all of the geometry on top of itself. The thing that people fail to understand here at the beginning is that the mirror modifier is very, very, very dependent on the origin of the object, right? And so manipulating the origin is the point around which the mirror happens. It's the mirror point is the origin. And so by default, the origin for this sphere is in the middle of the sphere. And so it's taken this half of the sphere and flipped it over on top of this half of the sphere, which was there already. And it's taken this half of the sphere and flipped it over on that one, which was also there already. And so this is really, you haven't improved anything. In fact, you've created a 3D modeling problem, and then now we got geometry sort of on top of geometry here, which is not good. So if I come now into the origin menu and start to look at this here, and so now I turned on that checkbox, and now I'm manipulating the origin. And so now if I start to move the origin of the sphere for this, and I'm going to mirror on the Y, there we go. And so now you see what happens, right? As I move the origin, this is the point around which things get duplicated. And so the modifier is making that one. And so usually when people see this, then it clicks, right? That what's going on here. Because when you initially apply it and the anchor point is in the middle, then it does that and it's just flipped it on top of itself there. And there we go. It doubles it like so. The axis matters here, right? So if I put it on X, now if I move it this way, you'll see it's moving over there. So this, and then also let's go back to X and then also bisect on the X. And so here we can see what's happening. Let's go ahead and do this. Okay, and I'll turn this on so we can see what's happening. Back to here. There we go. So with the bisect off, it's duplicating it, and that's it. Just duplicates it, flipped on the axis. With the bisect on, watch what happens as they get closer. Now, when they start to come in contact, this gets sliced off so that we don't have this internal overlapping geometry there, right? Here it is. With it off, everyone now knows that in this instance, that's generally not something you want to have, right? Where a lot of like internal geometry there. I mean, it's not the end of the world, but in general, it's not the best. We want to make the outer shell of whatever it is we're trying to make. And so turning on that bisect does that. It flips it like that. And so that allows for that to be happening along whichever axis it is that you're working there. So in this instance, if I changed it to Z, if I move this up, there we go. So now you see it's doing it there on the Z axis. If I bisect along the Z, there we go. Right, so I did bisect along the Z and you see it disappeared. That's because we bisected everything away. If we flipped it, it would come back. There we go. And so now it's lined up. In this case, it creates some really clean geometry. So this is super useful. For instance, I mean, anytime you're making something that is symmetrical, you really want to be just modeling one side of it, not both sides. So for instance, if we make Suzanne there we go. Let's go back to the manipulating the object for right now. There we go. And now I'll apply the mirror. And I'll do bisect and axis. And now you can sort of see what is happening here. And so if it is, in this case, lined up in the middle of the world, if I were to come in this direction, there we go. Now I'm in a situation where I have bisect and axis on. So my point here, most of the time you want this on. Okay, whatever axis you are flipping over, you do want to be bisecting, right? So that you don't end up with this internal geometry on the other side. It's usually the best practice. And so now, if I come in here and start to manipulate some of this geometry, you see that I can manipulate this in a symmetrical fashion. If I grab parts of it, again, I'm manipulating the right-hand side, and the left-hand side happens automatically there. With Suzanne, Suzanne's very low poly and all quad topology, and so it, if I tab out there, Suzanne's, because it is all quad topology, is very good for the subdivision surface. And you see that, especially with the shade smooth, then allows us to tab back in and make changes to I'm just grabbing points and hitting G and moving them around here, but allows me to manipulate the geometry and have it be, completely correct on the other side there. So the main things here with the mirror modifier, bisect on would probably be my default here, whatever axis it is that you're using. Also, origin, 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 that's where we're flipping around. This is the part that makes it difficult for students to understand what's happening at the beginning. And we want to make sure that we are not do not duplicate internal geo. If you have bisect on, it usually helps with that. In addition, the mirror modifier is fusing the two halves together. Okay, it's merging them here. So if I were to, if this was actually just one half of Suzanne, right? So if we came in here, I'm going to turn the modifiers off, and then let's go into wireframe mode. and just get rid of half of the faces, like so. There we go. We've essentially, I've done manual bisection. I've just selected half of it. When I do things like this, I'll always go into wireframe mode so that I can easily select through the object. And you probably want to be seeing the actual wireframe when you're doing that kind of operation anyway. So now you can see what happens if I turn this back on. The other half is restored. However, now there's this big slice in the middle. And if I turn on the subdivision surface, that smooths it, but we still have this slice in the middle. And so this slice in the middle now is the merge distance. And so if I hold shift and dial this up, it will get to the point where it will sort of merge those back together. The things that are, it's going to merge things that are together, points together that are closer than this threshold. Closer. So the distance between them is less than this threshold. If I were, but why not just crank this up? I'll keep cranking it and watch what happens. Suzanne slowly gets obliterated because more and more of the points are less than this, and they're getting merged together. So in instances like this, where you have half of the object that you're trying to model and then flip it over, having the correct merge distance, flattening those out, we'll get to that kind of thing later when we make some other stuff. But yeah. Even creatures that may eventually end up slightly asymmetrical, like fish or sharks or anything, it usually makes sense to do the initial modeling symmetrical, right? Or we're going to have two legs, even if one of them's a little bit bigger than the other, right? If you're modeling Hellboy, right? Hellboy has one small regular size hand and one giant hand, and you'd probably model them regular, and then later, right? What would I have to do, not Mark, in order to use the mirror modifier to create this new monkey face? But now it's come time. I like this. I sent it to my client, and they're like, "Yeah, it looks great." Except I want one ear to be bigger than the other. What do I do now? Because I've used the mirror modifier to create the symmetry. Convert to mesh, right? I need to get access to the mirrored geometry, right? Because if I make this ear bigger over here, the other one gets bigger, right? And so we need to commit to the mirroring now. We don't need to commit to the subdivision. So I'm commitment shy. I only want to commit as much as I need to. So I'm going to delete the subdivision surface there, and I'm going to tab back to object mode, right click and say convert to mesh, which is the way I apply modifiers usually. There we go. And there we go. Now it's a mesh. So now if I tab back in, I have access to this ear, which I could make bigger. And then I could subdivision surface the whole thing and send that back to my client. I'm like, how do you like this? One ear is bigger than the other. The other smart thing to do here is before I convert to mesh, save incremental so that I could step back later, and when the client inevitably says, "That's great, we want it to be the other ear," then we can go back and make that change then. Any questions about the mirror modifier? So the subdivision surface is doing the rounding work here, right? Stepping back to the bevel idea, right? Why did we bevel? So we could get these specular highlights for the work that's, for the light that's happening there. If we were to go back to the area light, turn off the sunlight, there we go. Now we can see the specular highlights. And so this is the two main ways we want rounded edges for the reasons that we discussed previously. The two ways to go about it are either the bevel, which is going to be more of the hard surface workflow, and this will get filled out more as we continue. The other way is the sub-D surface, subdivision surface modifier. And this is more of what's referred to as an organic, or, I mean, when you use the subdivision surface, it's usually just referred to as sub-D surface modeling, right? So hard surface modeling versus sub-D surface modeling. So as you're working here at the beginning, I would view these as an either or. There should not be, if you find yourself applying both a bevel and a sub-D surface modifier to the same object, I would stop myself and probably not do that for the next 4 weeks or so until you have a much deeper understanding of what it is you're doing. Are there some instances where you could use both together? Yes, there are. But especially here at the beginning, a lot of the intuition here is correct, but ends up being problematic in that my object looks blocky and I want it to be rounded and more smooth. And so you're like, I'll bevel it. And the bevel doesn't really work out how you want. And you're like, I want it to look smoother, even more smoother. You know what? I'm going to throw a sub-D on top of the bevel. And that is not, you're going to end up just creating A, a ton of geometry, and then B, it's not going to, like, it's just not the best way to go about that. It's usually an either or situation. I'm using this strategy or I'm using that strategy. So keep that in mind. Don't put both of these on the same object for right now. And so with Suzanne here, right, Suzanne is not a hard surface model. Suzanne is a creature, right? So there's limited flat faces here, right? This is not supposed to look like a machine. It's supposed to be some sort of smoother, more regular organic form. And so we rounded out Suzanne with the subdivision surface modifier here. And that works really well because Suzanne by default is almost all quads. I mean, not here in the middle of the eye, but it works out fine. The solution, if you do that and Suzanne still isn't smooth enough for your liking, the solution is not to add another subdivision surface modifier. The solution is to add a singular level of subdivision. So do not click and drag this. Simply take discrete steps up the subdivision chain. Right, so there's no subdivision. 1, 2, 3. How many is enough? How many do we want? Mark? Just enough, right? Incredibly important in this case, right? Because every time we click up that level from 1 to 2 to 3, the number of faces gets multiplied by 4. So that slider is, I wish they made it bigger in the interface. So it can be a very important number. Now, this just enough decision has to do with the silhouette of the object, right? And so this, as I think we talked about this a little bit briefly, right? If this shot is going to be a close-up of Suzanne's face, we definitely need, 3 or maybe 4 levels here, right, to make it look smooth. If this is a wide shot of the Suzanne face in the distance, we could probably get away with like 1, and it'll look smooth enough for the shot, right? And we've saved ourselves not like half as many faces, an order of magnitude less faces by doing that, right? I referred to this before, this idea of, for right now, you're doing this manually, right? You're just sort of saying like, am I close to this or am I far away? How big is it in the frame? And then you're choosing the subdivision level appropriately. In the future, you may never have to do this again because there's more and more LODs being built in, levels of detail, where the computer automatically updates the amount of subdivisions based on whether or not it's larger or smaller in the frame. This happens in games to some extent automatically if it's built in, and there's of course a Blender add-on for it, but like here, yeah, for right now, in order to understand the concept, being able to do that. Good. Questions about that? So sort of a double 2-for-1 there. We learned about the mirror modifier, and then because we use Suzanne, we got to take a little bit deeper dive / review on the subdivision surface. And now that you know about the bevel and you know about the subdivision surface, you realize you have 2 strategies here for making smoother edges, smoother corners. Yes?
Can you do the same thing that you did with the bevel where you can now select the face and make a vertex group?
No, like it's a different mechanism for the subdivision surface.
Everything's going to subdivide if you're going to add another level.
Yeah, for right now, yes. Yeah. Like it's a deeper dive there with that one. With the bevel, you make a vertex group. We know about vertex groups, but yeah, if we want, you can. It's technically possible. You have to get into weighting the whole thing at that point. Then
Into what?
you have to weight paint the different parts of the So, and so you can control it, but it takes. Yeah, we're not going to do that right now. Okay, sound good? Okay, great. Now, one more word about the subdivision surface. Why do they have the same parameter there twice? This is the number of levels that we would see in the viewport, and this is the number of levels that we would see in the render. Why is that the case? When we're just doing Suzanne here, which is not a ton of faces, it's fine. But the idea is that we want to have less faces while we're working, but later when we render it out, we want it to look as good as possible. And so you can say, okay, I want it to be less while I'm working, but then later make it 1 better, okay? So for right now, while you guys are doing this, I would make both of these numbers the same. We're not going to be working with things that are so big that it's going to be an issue. Otherwise, you're going to end up in a situation where, again, you've thrown yourself into a non-WYSIWYG situation where this is what you're looking at in the editor, right? And so here I'll go Control-Alt-0. There we go. There's our framing of Suzanne. And so now look at Suzanne's arched eyebrow. And then if I render this frame, look at this. We can compare here and here. See how this one is smoother than this one? This is the render, and the render is set to 2. And this is the viewport, which is set to 1, okay? So ultimately, it's good to know about this so that you can leverage it, right? Like let's say you're going to have some sort of super smooth Suzanne for the render. Well, then setting the subdivision surface to something greater here. But if you keep them the same, like if I put them both at 2 and then render, there we go. Now, you'll see that they are the same here and the same here. And I've restored WYSIWYG. What does that stand for again? What you see is what you get, right? You live it. You're alive during an amazing time in computer graphics, and that most of what we're doing at this point is WYSIWYG, where you can see the results. We don't have to, type a bunch of stuff into a computer, send it to a mainframe, and then come back in 2 weeks to figure out what happened, right? We can just sort of see the stuff happen in real time. This is a relatively recent development, right? This is not the case in Toy Story 1, right? Like Toy Story 1, they would have, almost none of this is in place at that point, right? The tools would look, even knowing what you know now, they would seem ludicrously primitive compared to Blender 5.0. What year does Toy Story 1 come out?
2001 or 99, I can't remember which.
Yeah, I was going to say before that. 95. But in your defense, Sean, you were born in,
2000.
yeah. Yeah, 95. Okay, and yeah, we got our mirror, we got our sub-D surface, we got our ba, 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 ba. Let's write an addendum here. I want rounded edges. We talked about, we have our bevel strategy, which is going to be hard surface modeling. We have our sub-D surface strategy, which is going to be, sub-D modeling. In both of these cases, these modifiers should be the end of the stack. Okay. Now that you know way more modifiers than you did at the beginning, you should leverage that power and use multiple modifiers to create more intricate stuff. Absolutely. But for the most part, I think a good rule of thumb here at the beginning is that these modifiers that create these rounded edges should be at the end of your stack of modifiers, right? Certainly if you're using mirror, you'd want the mirror before these things. Okay, great. Let's do one other thing. Okay, so we have a lot of tools now for starting with primitives and then turning them into manipulating them using modifiers, right? Let's look at something that will open up a lot more shapes. Let's use some curves. So next menu down here under curve, we're going to go Bezier. And now I can define 3D shapes using 2D lines. So over here, if you just say new Bezier curve, it makes this little, curve. And please take note that by default, it is on the floor. Okay, remember the floor plane in Blender is which plane? A plane is defined by two axes. Sean?
I don't have a proper label for it, but it would be like the XY.
That's exactly right. Your totally proper. It is the XY plane, right? Anytime we talk about, because we have 3 dimensions, right? And if we want to define a plane, it needs to, a plane has to have 2, right? And so there's the XY plane, there's the YZ plane, and there's the ZX plane, and then the XY plane. There's only 3, right? And so the floor is the XZ plane, okay? And this is under normal circumstances, right? I'm not making an upside down room. I'm not making some sort of like ring world or something like that. We're talking about regular room, right? With gravity, floor, ceiling, walls, that kind of stuff, right? Obviously, if you start to manipulate things in a weird way, this would not be true. But here, just regular stuff, right? And so by default here, when I say make me a new curve, it puts it on the floor, okay? Now, the thing that's a little bit awkward here is that when you make a new curve in Blender, you think about it, you're making this container for curves, right? The object is going to be like, you know, this curve object that's the container. And so most of the time when you make a new curve, you have to make curve, then delete the existing points, and then draw your own stuff, okay? So those 3 things. So here, you know, curve, tab, delete, vertices. Okay, that sort of clears the floor, the object. But the Bezier curve is still here. And most of the time, I'll be using this, which is sort of the freehand drawing for the curves, not to be confused with this, which looks very similar. This is the annotate tool for just like writing stuff on the scene, like more notes, not making stuff, okay? And so don't be confused there. It is, notice that things are grouped together, and it is the top one in this group once you have made a curve object and you have entered edit mode. And so now, if I select the draw and just start scribbling stuff here, you can see that it's making these curves, like so. If you come over here to the curve object, there's a bunch of stuff here, and this by itself is not anything. Just like we talked about before, if I were to render this, even if I were to put it in the view here somehow, there we go, kind of like that. I'll go Control Alt 0. There we go. The curves are in the view, and I press F12. Nothing, because there's no surface to reflect light off of. So the curves themselves, if you come over here and go to geometry, there is their bevel. And so if I dial this up, you see that they become tubes. However, in Blender 5, there's, I think, a better way to go about this, and that is my curve to tube modifier. They've done some improvements here that make the end, once we start dealing very closely with the ends of the tubes, there's some significant problems that the other using the other system has, and they've corrected some of them here with this curved tube. And also it sort of separates things out. I think it's a little bit easier. So this gives us a lot of our controls here. And so this, as you can see, really opens up our world of making stuff here in terms of having a lot more stuff that we can make. Things will be drawn. How are they being? Because now you're like, oh wow, this is great. I can just draw stuff in the viewport here. Look at all this stuff that I'm drawing. I'm in edit mode, and now that I have that modifier on there, you see that everything gets updated, and so that all of the stuff can be changed at the same time. It's all of these curves are in the same. They're in a single object here. Everybody with me? That's great, but then as soon as you start looking at this, you're like, it's really hard to control what's going on here? Where is this in space, right? And so this is the part that's not totally obvious here at first, is that the draw, there we go. The draw is perpendicular to the camera, to the viewport camera. So as I'm just haphazardly moving my view around the scene, it's drawing it flat to that view. That's the default. You can change this, but let's say that's the default. So a good way to visualize this is if you look at the actual camera object, right, just for visualization purposes. This pyramid here, did I tell you before what that's called? Frustrum. Am I spelling that right? Yeah. Okay, that's the name for this visualization of the camera view here, this pyramid shape. And so if I were to move the camera just as an object here, there we go. That was weird. Okay, there we go. I'll do this. I'm not sure what the heck's going on there. Like so, see how this is like this plane that's flat to the view of the camera? Here. This is the plane that you're drawing on when you're using the draw tool. So this, if you're just making a bunch of freehand squiggles, if I come back here and then tab back into edit mode, this is fine, right? I don't need to be super accurate with it. But as soon as you want to start actually making stuff usable, it doesn't make sense to draw it like this because its position in space ends up being really imprecise at that point. So a better rule here is when you want to draw something precise, draw in orthographic view. Because this will mean you're drawing it either straight down on the XY plane or one of the walls, the XZ or YZ plane. And then at that point, you're able to manipulate something because it's all been flat there. Or even if you want to curve it, there's different ways to go about that. But that's one option. The other option here is to draw on the surface of some other topology, right? This, maybe we end up, maybe you just use the topology as a guide and then we don't see it later, or maybe you end up using it or not. So, for instance, I'm going to tab into edit mode here on this one, press A, and delete all of these vertices. There we go, I'm back to just nothing. And so now if I look down from the top here and I start drawing stuff, now, like I want some sort of squiggly thing, now if I move around, I've drawn that and it's flat and it's in a discernible orientation to the gizmo, right? And so now if I want to turn that into like a backdrop or something, I can, rotate this, or once I get out of origin mode, I can rotate this and manipulate it in a way that makes sense, right? The relationship between the drawing itself and the axis is not weird. It's not at some weird angle where I need to do a bunch of strange rotations to try and make it work, right? It's sort of straight up and down, and I can manipulate everything that way. Similarly, if I wanted to draw, in this direction, make sure I have it selected, tab into edit mode, and go over here like this, and then come back out. You see that these two things are perpendicular to each other, right? Again, like a discernible relationship. Now they're linked to each other here, or not linked, they're both curves in the same object. If I wanted this one to be independent of that one, I would want to make a new curve object first, then draw in that curve object. So drawing in orthographic mode. The other option here is a good example to do this is we'll do it on a sphere. And so I'll bring up this sphere. Now let's move it over a little bit and scale this up and put shade smooth on it just because. Now I'll make a new curve object, Shift A, curve, Bezier, tab, A, delete, just getting rid of those points. Now I'll make sure I have the draw, and then up here we can go to snap to face project. So make sure snap is on, make sure it's at the face project. And now, if I were to draw, it draws onto the surface of the sphere, or it should, unless I've missed something. Here we go. Let's come back here. Let me turn on the curve to tube modifier. There we go. And I'm going to turn that one off. Back here. Why is that not doing it? I'm missing one thing. That's on. Snap is on. Project. Oh, over here. Surface. Yeah. Actually, do we need this on at all? No. Okay, even easier. You just click it over there. Just click from cursor to surface. Now, you'll see that I can draw onto the surface of the sphere, which is something that I could then, choose to either keep or not keep later, right? And this has been, projected onto that. But it needs to be visible while I'm doing the drawing. So those would be two options here for the initial drawing, and I believe this just projects onto whatever is visible, right? And so now I'm drawing stuff onto the floor over here, like so. And so this face project is handy, but you can see like in certain instances it can really get kind of out of hand there. Let's delete that point. The other thing you can do that I usually don't do, that you'll see people online do a lot, that I just don't find all that useful, is if you grab the end of a curve and press E, it extrudes it out. And so you can just keep sort of extruding it. I don't know. I don't find that way of creating super intuitive.
Sometimes the toolbar, I don't have that for the curves. I just don't have all the other tools. Where would be the draw? Where are the curve tools? Shouldn't they
Do you
come
have,
here?
you have to go back to,
On the left side.
yep, yeah, you have to select the object
Yeah.
in object mode. So go back to object mode, make sure you have that object selected, then go to edit mode. All right, so the edit mode tools shift depending on which object you're editing.
I see. Okay. Yeah. I still don't have it, but I'll figure it out.
Is the thing that you made an actual curve? Does it have this icon?
Yep. Yep. Object first. Select it. And then drop down to edit. Still getting the wrong tools. Oh, I'll find it, but I know what to look for.
All right, let me look afterwards. There's gotta be something. Okay, a couple things about the curves here. Obviously we can dial up and down the thickness. That's a major part of it. The next major part here is the sampling. So let's go to this mode, wireframe, and we can sort of see what's happening here. It's trying to figure out where it's curvier and where it's not, and giving you more subdivisions at those places. The resolution here, this is the amount of subdivisions going around the tube itself. And so by default, I think it was 8. That's usually pretty good. The shade smooth is on. The resample mode here, if I go to count, this is the number of subdivisions along the actual tube. So by default there, it's under evaluated, which gives you this. If I go back to count, now I can sort of change it per segment, right? And so you see that ends up with like maybe too many for the short one, but not enough for that one. And so length then would allow you to more equally distribute these. Now this one and this one have the same density per the same amount of length. So length there is probably a good solution. Then over here, caps. Caps are going to be what happens at the end of the tube. And so by default, we're on flat caps there. And this is one of the major improvements, is that we can go to rounded caps, and we get a rounded cap here that doesn't look like total garbage geometry, which is which was really not easy to do with just a few clicks previously. So So here, rounding these things, making sure the curves are smooth enough. You see how this is related to the subdivision surface idea, right? It's, for the most part, you shouldn't put a subdivision surface on the curves, right? You can control that directly in the curve to tube via the resampling distance, right? And so here, again, same principle. If we look at this, if we're really far away, we could probably get away with, some sort of much less amount of subdivision. But if we're much closer, we need to turn this up so that this, or turn it down because it's the distance in between, so that this looks smooth. And then we have our caps here, whether they're round or flat, or what is custom? Oh, you can put something on the ends. That's nice. We'll get to that. Yeah. Now, with the scaling here, we can make it fat or skinny, or we can come over here to this tool, which allows us to control the radius per point. And so if you select a point and click and drag, you can make that point fatter. If you select another point and drag down, you can make that point skinny, fat, skinny, fat. You get the idea. If you need more control points, that's when you would use the subdivide tool, right? So after you draw, the default settings give you a pretty good number of points, right? Because you end up with these Bezier control points here in edit mode, If I were to select one, we have a Bezier handle where I can select this and then hit G and control the Bezier handle for what's happening here. But let's say I want a Bezier handle between here and here. And so I could select both of those points here and here, and then right click, subdivide, and now I've got another point here in the middle. But you don't want more, you want just enough points. And so now notice I can take that point and lift it off the sphere because I'm no longer drawing that surface restriction is only for the initial projection of the drawing. It's not for, it doesn't continue to be stuck to the surface or projected onto the surface there. If I grab a bunch of points and I switch to the randomize tool, this sort of randomizes their rotation or their location. It just sort of scatters them kind of everywhere. It's not super useful unless you're making a giant, mess of stuff. But yeah, now we can do this. Okay, that's pretty good. Let's, I'm gonna put a material on this. And a material here. So drawing the curves is super fun, but definitely check in over here to make sure that the geometry is not completely ridiculous, right? We don't want them looking like this, right? Where they're just super jammed. This is uneditable and super inefficient. How much topology do we want along the length? Just enough. And so length here in most of our instances is going to work well. And then also going around, especially for a round surface, unless the round surface is gigantic, 8 is going to get the job done, right? You see here, it does look blockier because I made this part of it really fat. And so maybe that needs a little bit more there, but for the skinny parts, that's overkill. But you don't want to change the amount of subdivisions along the length. That just makes the topology really unmanageable. So.
The data tab on the curve? I'm not finding it.
For what? The
What you're just doing,
no, that's in the modifier. All the adjustments I've been making to the topology are all in the curve to tube modifier. Okay, it's just an easier way to go about it, I think, than the very verbose menu that exists under the curve tab. Okay. Curves are happening there. What was the thing I wanted to go to next? So now, some of those other mesh shapes that we haven't used can be useful here. So if we go to curve, you can make a circle, right? And so this is now, a circle curve that can have the tube modifier applied. Essentially a torus here, but now we can come in and modify this in order to do whatever we would want with this one. And let's say this and this. I'll grab both of those and go into this tool here and make those skinnier. Grab this one and make those fatter. And you can see we can get to some shapes that would be difficult to produce using other means. So I always go into wireframe mode here when I'm making these adjustments about exactly how much I'm going to need in terms of these subdivisions. Scale that up. Control A, apply scale. There we go. And then you could start to combine these sort of things, right? So say, for instance, I want something along here. Let's tab into, let's make a new one. So object mode, Shift A, curve, tab A, delete. And then I want to draw something along this, make sure it's on surface. And kind of like that. There we go. And then put the modifier on here. Just searching for tube brings it right up. And there we go. Now this part of it over here, this could get fatter. And these could become skinnier. This one we don't need. Delete vertex. There we go.
How are you editing the individual points again?
I'm just clicking on them, right? So when I'm in this tool, I'm selecting one, and then it gives me the yellow, just like that yellow handle. This is the yellow circle. So clicking and dragging in the circle. You have to click in the circle. Once you click in the circle and then hold it down, then you can make the point fatter or skinnier. The Bezier handles are a little bit maybe harder to get your mind around. So you can grab the middle point, press G and move it around. But then the end of the Bezier handles here, trying to click on them is tough. And so a lot of times I just draw a square over them and then press G. So you're not moving this point, you're moving the handle, which allows you to do that. And then, yeah, this could have its own thing there, right? And so now that and that are, well, they're not together yet. And so there's this one and this one. And so this would be something where I probably want to take this, and this will be, pink accent. And this thing is the gold shape. And now I'll take pink accent and shift drag it underneath gold. There we go. And so now if I'm back in object mode and move this around, they're stuck to that. All right. So then now they're together. If I scale, everything comes along. But I was parenting them, and so I still have access to this separately. So it has its own settings here, which I could adjust as I see fit over there. Okay, let's package this stuff up. I'm going to save incremental. The other thing that's useful here is coming up in the top. let's shift A and make one more curve. Tab, all, delete. Okay, and now besides the freehand drawing tool, there's a tool that works a lot like Illustrator. The Illustrator pen tool, for those of you familiar with the Illustrator pen tool, where we're placing individual vertices. And if you click and drag, you're controlling the curvature of those vertices. And so here, if I just click, I can make something that's more, doesn't have any sharp edges. Now, or only has sharp edges. If I click and drag, it pulls out a Bezier handle, and then you don't close it off. If you select the curve itself, where is this? Is it in the data? Where is that? I thought it was just there. Did I do something weird with this one? I don't think I did. Let's try it one more time. Bezier curve. There we go. Tab. And delete those. There we go. And I don't remember hunting for this before. So in Blender, the idea to close it off is to make it cyclic. C-Y-C-L-I-C. Am I just losing my mind? Can I not see it over here? Are you guys seeing anything that says cyclic under the curve tab? We're in 3D. Twist method, smooth, fill, radius. Bevel. Nope, 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 nope. Okay, so if you use the pen tool, then select all the points, and then Alt-C, which is easy to remember because it's cyclic. This will essentially close the shape, close the curve, right? So just like in Illustrator, like that. Now in Illustrator, if you click that very last point, it will do it. But you always just run the risk of like, you didn't close it, you just added another point that was like really close to the first point. And for whatever reason, I'll figure out why that is. There used to be a button that you could just toggle, but the Alt-C does this. And so right here, right, watch right here. And so if I have everything selected, Alt-C, boom, closes it, uncloses it, closes it, uncloses it. And over here, let's add the tube here. There we go. And so now, again, we can see more accurately. Right. And now we've got a shape that we could edit. Come back to select mode, be able to select different faces, or points rather. And we have our sharp edges. So most of the time I'm using the, like, anytime I need to draw just some sort of like more organic curvy thing, it's this. Anytime I need to be more dialed in, it's this, right? And so for instance, let's tab out here. Or actually, I'm gonna press slash to focus just on this one I made. I still got those extra points there. Let's get those off the table. And so now I'm gonna turn on, actually no, that doesn't work. You have to do this, right? So if I wanted to draw something more precisely geometric, like so, there we go. And then Alt-C, that does that. Now if I grab all of the points here, let's go back to the select tool, grab all the points for this one. Right click and you can snap selection to grid. Boom. So there's what I drew, like quasi-geometric, but not precise. Curve, snap, selection to grid. Boom, snaps it to the grid. Now I've got something that'll work there. And additionally, I can toggle cyclic is over here. I guess they only want you to find it through the shortcut. Cool. Okay, so now, yeah, I can change this. I can smooth it out if I need to resample this under length, for instance, here, to give me something. Let's look at this. If that's going to be that fat, you might need a little bit more there. So again, drawing in orthographic mode, right? So I press 7, I look down from the top. Now I'm in this one here, I come back to this one. And so now I can do stuff like this. and Control L, yeah, and then Alt C, that closes that off. And then I have these. So when these are all in the same object, right? And so I'm able to adjust all of them at the same time. But there's clearly different segments. And so here the Control L is what in Cinema 4D we used to be called select connected. And that's essentially what's happening here. Select connected. This is useful when you have multiple meshes or multiple curves in the same object, right? And so I want to be able to edit this. Like this one is already snapped to the grid. This one is not. So I select this point, I Control L, get all of those points, then curve, snap to grid, boom, just snaps that part, right? So I don't have to snap the other part. If I want to just snap this one, I select all of those points. That's easy. Selecting all of these points with the selection tool is not easy because of this overlapping situation here. And so if I just select this point and then Control L, that gives me all those ones. And now I can move those discretely from the other ones. But I'm on the top-down view here, and so this makes it easy to draw a bunch of very precise stuff. Now here, again, select tool, select one point, Control L, grab all of them. Alt C closes that one off. I'll try and figure out where that button went. And then curve, snap, grid, boom. Could grab all three of these and Shift D, and I can duplicate just this part, right? And so you see now I'm like really opening up a lot of possibilities here that were not on the table previously. If I want to add stuff to the end here, E, remember extrudes out, E, 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 there you go. And so now slash out, I'm back to this. This is all one object, tab out, and let's come back to here. There we go. And I've got this that I can erect as a backdrop for this. Give it a material. There we go. And if I wanted to get really crazy, again, stack the modifiers.
When you use snap to grid, it's not going to make them angular. It's not going to turn a curve into something angular, right?
No.
You just drew it in a very
Yeah, I used the pen tool, and I did not click and drag. I just clicked to make a point rather than, you know, drag out a Bezier handle. Yeah. Right, so combining, you know, a bunch of the stuff, the array, the tubes, all that kind of thing. And this is the array, right? So if I come back in and edit the original thing at any point, for instance, make this part fat, you see it does it for all of the array copies. And let's save incremental. And one more modifier to look at here. We'll just start the conversation on the Boolean. So we've got, let's tab back out, and let's bring in not that. Let's bring in a cube. There. And give that something. There we go. And the Boolean modifier is going to allow you to sort of cut away at objects with another object. So for instance, I'll make another cube here. Okay, another object, like so. I'll move this over like this. And then on this one, I'm going to come to the modifiers here and look for the Boolean. And you need to select what object is being cut away here. And so the dropper here is useful in selecting that. And so if I make that invisible now, you can see what's happening. This cube here, if I were to look at this, let's do this. As I move this one around, it is making a cut out of the other one, okay? At first, yeah, this looks great. So a couple things here. This is the Boolean modifier, okay? And so this Boolean, this idea that we can use simple logic here, the simple logic sort of being add and subtract. Most of the time in practice, we're subtracting one thing from another thing. And so this all, the term Boolean comes from George Boole, who sort of, invented / codified this idea of this logic of Venn diagrams, or we have this, and then this area represents this A and B. If this is A and this is B, this is A and B. The kind of Venn diagram stuff we've seen in many other instances. Anyways, that's where the word comes from. The Boolean modifier does this so that we can, do it in a way where we can update one thing with the other thing. The few things here is that both objects must be closed volumes, meaning that they don't have a hole in them. The term for this is that they need to be manifold. The way you can visualize this is, will they hold water? If you filled it up with water, would the water run out in anything, right? And so what would a non-manifold object look like? If we if I grab this object here and tab into edit mode and press G, and come over here and delete this face, there we go. This cube should be non-manifold now, right? If you filled the cube up with water, it would all run out over here, right? There's no wall over there. And so now if I tab back out and move this over here and then looked at it, it's still working in this case. But once we make it anything more complicated than that, in fact, if we rotated this, let's see if it would break. Yeah, we start to get somewhat weird results there. But I never use the Boolean modifier directly, like adding it like other modifiers. This is all much better handled under the add-on. There's a lot of add-ons for this. The free one the one that's built in here is called Boole Tools, which allows you to sort of easily subtract one from another without all of this setup, right? There's quite a few clicks there to get everything to happen. And there's also this visibility issue, right? You saw me turning it on and off. And Boole Tools really makes a lot of this easier. So in that instance, where's the other? Did I delete the other cube I made? I think I did. Shift A. Let's make a sphere here to start to talk about some of the problems. Okay, and then under Edit, Preferences, Add-ons, I believe it's here. Or not. Is it here? Yeah, right here. Bull tool. Let's turn that one on. And there we go. And now click, click. Let's look at that one. So going to the page is super useful in a lot of instances. Here we go. Yeah, so this lets you do things that are a little bit more, it's just a better way to work with this. So the isn't it control minus my shortcut? We'll pick it up there next time. So install Bull tool. And after we look at everybody's stuff on Wednesday, we'll finish, because this is the last modifier I wanted to get through in this tranche of modifiers. So we'll pick this up there. But really, it's this whole tool. The tool here is confusing, right? Because it's called Bull tool, but we're going to be able to use it in a non-destructive way, hence being totally opposite of what I just told you tools are. So, but it's like a tool for making the modifier. And we'll pick it up there so we can do that fresh. I feel like we've maxed out our capacity for this morning. Sound good? So let's turn these things off. Let's turn these things on. We did all sorts of fun here. And then remember these guys? Beveling? That seems like a lifetime ago. And then all of our subdivision surface with our Suzanne. There we go. Let's turn that up. Let's scale that up. And there we go. There we go. When you see it all together, yeah, we ended up in some weird places. Okay, hold on. Everybody good? Okay, awesome. Let me make sure I didn't miss anything over here. Everything's good there.